Great. So our next speaker is Elijah Pelofske from Los Alamos National Laboratory, and he will give us talk about mapping state transition susceptibility in quantum annealing, completely different approach. So thanks again, Elijah, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Quick thumbs up if my if my slides are visible. Perfect. All right, awesome. Yeah, so, all right, yeah, my name is Elijah Pelofske, and I'm going to be talking about mapping state transition susceptibility in quantum annealing. All right. So first, okay, quantum annealing. So quantum annealing, so it's a specialized form, kind of a restricted form of quantum computing. And it aims to sample low energy states of combinatorial optimization problems, e.g., discrete variable assignment problems. So in particular, Ising models, QWorld models, these types of problems. D-wave quantum annealers in particular are physical implementations of quantum annealing. They use superconducting flux qubits. These devices have errors and suffer from decoherence from the environment, like every other type of quantum computing hardware that exists right now. The idea of quantum annealing is based on adiabatic evolution. It's based on adiabatic quantum computation. It's a little bit of like a heuristic of adiabatic quantum computation in the sense that we still we're not perfectly isolated from the environment. We have decoherence, so it's not the ideal computation, but kind of it's being actively investigated for its potential uses for in particular for sampling combinatorial optimization problems, as well as potentially things like Hamiltonian simulation, simulating interesting frustrated magnetic systems. Generally any type of Hamiltonian simulation that you can do on the quantum annealer. Now, equation 1 defines the type of Hamiltonian that is implemented in particular on D-wave quantum annealers. And it's important to note this because it's not a general Hamiltonian. It doesn't have as many degrees of freedom, for example, as Rydberg analog Hamiltonian simulation platforms. So in particular, the second term there with the prefactor of B of S, those two summations define the linear and the quadratic terms of the user-defined Ising model that you want to sample, that you want to find the optimal solutions of. So the first sum there is over all of your linear terms, and those are encoded. The coefficients for those terms are encoded on the qubits of your hardware, and then the couplers are encoded with the quadratic terms of your Ising model or your QWorld model that you want to sample. And then the initial summation there, with the one with the A of S term, that defines your transverse field Hamiltonian. That is what the quantum annealer initial state is. That's what the process begins in. It begins in this superposition across all qubits. And then you slowly apply this classical Hamiltonian, right, that describes your optimization problem. So in this sense, it's this type of continuous time analog quantum computation. The state of all of the qubits are then read out at the end of the anneal. And these results are, probabilistic, like other forms of quantum computation. So you want to measure kind of a large distribution at the end of the computation. And ideally, if you're in particular, if you're trying to sample an optimization problem, the goal is that at the end you are sampling an optimal solution. All right. So D-wave quantum annealers in particular have a couple of interesting kind of features that were introduced to the hardware. The first one I'm going to mention is something called reverse quantum annealing. The idea here is that you initialize the anneal in a well-defined classical state, so like a bit string or a vector of spins. And then you introduce the transverse field Hamiltonian during the anneal, which introduces more quantum fluctuations. The idea of introducing your transverse field Hamiltonian into the annealing process is that you will make use of quantum fluctuations like quantum tunneling in order to reach lower energy states. And you know, based on the adiabatic theorem, right? Kind of if you're sufficiently isolated from the environment and you go for long enough, then you should be able to sample pretty good solutions. But with reverse quantum annealing, the idea is, well, okay, if you start in a well-defined classical state and then you just introduce some quantum fluctuations, you're effectively performing a more local search around that initial state. H-gain state encoding is a somewhat recent methodology that me and some other co-authors introduced, which uses this feature of D-Wave called H-gain. And we use this to show that you can do a very similar thing to reverse quantum annealing. You can encode a specific classical state into the annealing process kind of at any time point during the anneal using this H-gain schedule, which is what the feature set is in the D-Wave SDK if you look it up. Using this H-gain schedule along with specifying kind of your encoded state using the linear terms of your Ising model. And so equation 2 here is defining what the H-gain state encoding or what the H-gain method or hardware feature actually does. In particular, the only thing that's different between this equation and the previous equation is the G of T prefactor. What that is defining is basically a multiplier as a function of time, you know, continuous time, specifically on your linear terms. And so that's what the term H-gain is, right? You're kind of amplifying your linear terms by some multiplicative factor. So the idea of this paper is to use reverse annealing to initialize the quantum annealer in a classical state, in some classical state, and then use H-gain state encoding to encode a different classical state. Let's call this state B. And the idea is that we can map the states from A to B during quantum annealing. For these experiments, we set B to be a ground state of the Ising model, since quantum annealing is intended to sample, the ground states of your optimization problem. And the question is, how difficult is this mapping process, right? Like, how many of the samples at the end of the anneal are in state B, right? Or are there kind of interesting dynamics that occur in this transition, right? When you're very intentionally mapping from one well-defined spin, vector to another well-defined spin vector. Next we can, enumerate through all possible initial states A in order to map the state transition processes. Of course, you can imagine that this would only work for kind of small combinatorial optimization models if you do want to enumerate overall the possible initial states. And so for this project, I just selected some small Ising models. So from left to right, I just called them N6, N7, and N8, referring to how many variables they have. These are Ising models, so their variable assignments are +1 or -1, right, spins. Quadratic weights of +1 are encoded as blue edges, and quadratic weights of -1 are encoded as red edges in these problem graphs. These graphs are just showing visually what these Ising models look like. The cyan nodes are just representing, the linear terms. They have coefficients of 0, which we will need in order to plant the states using the H-gain state encoding method. Okay, so one nice thing that we can do is, because these models are so small, we can kind of, embed them in parallel across the D-Wave chip. This is a graph rendering of one of the D-Wave QPU Pegasus hardware graphs. This is Advantage System 4.1. And I'm sorry, that's the chip, the D-Wave chip ID of this device. And so we can tile these all onto the chip, right, completely independently, and then we can execute them all in parallel, right, parallel quantum annealing. And what that allows us to do is get, pretty good statistics for the measurements we make, and also it hopefully helps us avoid local biases that might occur on specific parts of the hardware. All right, yeah. So this is just kind of a list, if you're interested, of the specific device settings I use, right? So okay, so the Ising models, right? The discrete optimization variable assignments. We drew 1,000 samples for each of the varied device settings, plus the parallel embedding of the Ising models means, you know, the total number of samples gets multiplied by roughly 500. So we get very, very robust statistics for these measurements. We use 100 microseconds for the annealing time. We set the reverse annealing fraction to 0.65. The anneal fraction is the S term that is the input for the functions A and B. It is just defining what proportion of your kind of user-defined Hamiltonian is being applied to the system versus the amount of the transverse field Hamiltonian is being applied to the system. So 0.65 is somewhere in the middle. I sort of tuned this to get sort of an in-between, so it's so we can see kind of intermediate state transitions. Additionally, we use just a symmetric schedule with the pause duration of 60 microseconds. This is fairly arbitrary. It's just sort of a standard schedule that's used. It's not super complicated, but many other schedules could certainly be tested. For the H-gain schedule, we begin at an H-gain strength of 0, and then at 100 nanoseconds, we ramp up the H-gain strength to H, which must be between 0 and 3. Sorry, that's actually wrong. I think that's at yeah, no, that's right. Sorry, 100 nanoseconds. We ramp up the H-gain strength kind of as much as we can. So we're kind of pushing the anneal into that target state. And then near the end of the anneal, we just push it back down to 0, which means that effectively at the end of the anneal, you know, there's no linear terms in our Ising model. And then we reinitialize reverse annealing for each sample. And the exact device that is used for this is the D-Wave Advantage System 4.1. All right, here's some metrics that we'll use when looking at some of the results. So we'll look at the ground state success probability, right? Just, okay, look at all the samples. How many of the samples were in that specific ground state that we're looking at? We'll also be looking at kind of different distance vectors, right? Sort of like, okay, across all of the varying increments with which we try to push the anneal to the target ground state, what's kind of the success rate of that? Is it really easy? Is it really hard? That's what chi is in equation 4. Equation 5 is defining a very specific, is based on kind of looking at a very specific observation in the data, which is that for pushing states towards a specific ground state, sometimes it's very easy if you only need to bit flip like low Hamming weight variables, right? Like if you only need to bit flip like 1 or 2 variables, and then you hit a ground state. And so that's what equation 5 is trying to capture. All right, so here's the first result plot. So what we're looking at here on the x-axis is an increasing H-gain field strength that is applied. The stronger this is, the larger it is, the more we're trying to push the anneal into a specific state. In this case, we are targeting a specific ground state. That ground state, the variable assignments are shown kind of in the title of this plot. The details don't specifically matter. The y-axis is plotting what the success proportion is. So out of all of the anneals, how successful were we in actually pushing the state towards this very, very specific state? And each line is showing a different initial state that we've started from. And you can see that the behavior is quite it varies quite a lot, and there's kind of some interesting dynamics here. So what I did was I ran some unsupervised clustering on the results. Here I'm just coloring each plot a different color. So I've split up all of these results. This was for the N6 Ising, and you can see that there are clearly clusters of similar behavior when mapping, you know, all across all of these initial states towards a specific ground state. Another way that we can plot this is we can look at, so here the x-axis is kind of encoding what the exact states are of all of these vectors, all right? And then on the y-axis, we're plotting chi, right? This is basically saying, okay, how difficult was it to push our state into, you know, starting from our initial state into our ground state. Let's see, so the vertical dashed red lines are showing what all of the ground states are. And in particular, the red state in the kind of left-hand portion of the plot that is also a dashed red line, that is the target ground state. And so what this plot is showing is kind of the landscape of across all initial states, you know, how easy or hard is it to do the state transition. The coloring and the shapes of the data points are consistent with the unsupervised clustering that is performed. All right, and here's an example for an N7 Ising. Again, you can see there's very clearly some wildly different behavior. Something I want to point out is you can clearly see symmetries in this state mapping, right? If you look at kind of the middle of this plot, and then you imagine reflecting it across that axis, you can see that there's very clearly some interesting symmetries there. And this was also true with the N6 Ising as well. And this is just a different ground state for the N7 Ising. There were two ground states for the N7 Ising. And if I flip between this plot and this plot, you can see that they're mirrors of each other, which is pretty interesting. Looking at susceptibility measures for N6, what we see is that so D here is plotting the Hamming distance between your initial state and your ground state. And you can see that there's some sort of relationship. It's maybe like weakly linear, but maybe not super clear. This is actually consistent with previous studies on reverse annealing. With energy, though, there seems to be absolutely no correlation, which is really interesting, right? It means that you know, how hard it is to do a state transition correlates well with Hamming distance, not with energy. The very specific metric that I developed based on some of the observations in the data, which is, again, looking at kind of the Hamming distance away from like how many bit flips you need to do in order to get to your ground state, with respect to kind of the degree of the variable in your Ising model. That's what this right-hand plot is. We see a pretty interesting correlation there as well that seems at least somewhat clear. So there are interesting patterns that we see. Something else that I did was you can kind of look at all of the data in aggregate and try to figure out, you know, across all of these state transitions that we're doing, what's the most likely, what's the, you know, most measured transition that occurred for each node. And so here for the N6 Ising, I'm plotting you know, just a graph with 64 nodes, and then I'm drawing edges in between those nodes based on how based on like what states transition to what other states. The red nodes here are ground states, and all other nodes are some variation of, well, not a ground state. And you can see very clearly that there's, you know, interesting patterns. Like some states you have to transition into in order to reach a ground state. There's like clear intermediate state paths that are happening in the quantum annealer. A very similar story for
Elijah. Sorry for that. Can you please wrap up?
Yep. Yeah. And so something else that we can look at is targeting ground state to ground state transitions, right? So instead of just all states to some specific ground state, we can try to transition from a ground state to another ground state. There are degenerate ground states. And you can see clearly there's interesting dynamics there as well. In particular, what I want to emphasize is that one of the things that happens is you will transition through states that are not ground states, right? And when you're kind of constrained in this like partially, you know, somewhat like in between reverse annealing and, you know, you're at like this middle part of the anneal. And so you very clearly have to transition through, you know, non-ground states to get to a ground state, which is pretty interesting. I totally did not expect that. Yeah, and so this method is for, you know, mapping state transitions in quantum annealing. There are very clearly interesting symmetries. There's a lot of interesting future research topics, right? Like simulations. Can this be generalized to other algorithms that use adiabatic quantum computation? And yeah, so I just want to mention fast, I have an archive link. This was also published research in Physical Review Research. I also have all of the data for all of the experiments uploaded on Zenodo data sets. So if you want to take a look at that, you definitely can. Here's a bunch of references on quantum annealing and reverse annealing, a quick acknowledgement for Los Alamos. And that is all. Thank you so much for your time and your attention.
Thank you very much, Elijah. Very interesting topic, very interesting talk, and very promising results. Congratulations.